From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Friday, September 20th. Ever since former President Donald Trump falsely claimed the election was stolen, there's been a lot of talk about widespread fraud when it comes to absentee voting. But in Oregon, we've been using vote by mail for more than 20 years without evidence of systemic fraud. So it's been easy for Democrats to dismiss conservatives who have been raising questions about the system. Then, last week, news broke that hundreds of non-citizens were added to Oregon's voter rolls. We're going to discuss what the political fallout could be. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
And I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
Dirk, let's start out by describing what was some fairly head-turning news last week, a story that we expect could probably be around for a while. You got a tip on Friday that the Secretary of State was about to announce a problem with voter registration. What did you learn?
Yeah, well, they did announce a problem with voter registration. They said that they had undertaken a review of the state's voter rolls, actually the DMV had, and determined that at least 306 people who are not U.S. citizens have been registered to vote in Oregon since 2021. They also said that 2 of those people have voted. That's a problem, obviously, because non-citizens are not supposed to vote or be registered to vote in the state. We are told Secretary of State LaVon Griffin-Vilade learned this on September 12th, a day before the public learned it. According to her chief of staff, Ben Morris, she immediately acted to make sure that these people are being removed from the voter rolls. Here's Morris.
The secretary acted within 24 hours of hearing about this issue, and her actions today will ensure that this error will not impact the 2024 election. So out of this universe of 306 people, 2 individuals have a voting history. Their citizenship status at the time they voted is unknown.
As you can well imagine, Lauren, this is causing a fair amount of tumult and reaction in Salem, particularly because as this was announced, dramatic and often, we should say, unfounded claims about non-citizen voting are a big part of Republicans' focus this year on the congressional stage. Not so much here, but it's definitely sort of a talking point, in national politics.
306 people, I mean, that's not a ton of people in the grand scheme of Oregon elections. We have something like 3 million registered voters. But obviously, for obvious reasons, this news has inspired some reaction. As you reported, the problem seems to have started with the state's driver and motor vehicles. So let's just explain why we're talking about the DMV when we're talking about voting.
Because the DMV has a very important part to play in how the state adds new voters to its rolls. Listeners will know Oregon is a state that prides itself on innovation when it comes to its election policies. As you noted, Lauren, we have been using mail-in ballots exclusively since 2000 for all state elections. We were the first state to do that. And in 2016, the state took another innovative step. We instituted a law we call Oregon Motor Voter that ensured that the state registers people to vote when they obtain or renew a driver's license. This is known as an opt-out policy because unless a person proactively says they do not want to be registered, the state adds them to the voter rolls as long as they've demonstrated U.S. citizenship. This is a law that is credited, I think, with really opening up the option of voting to people who might otherwise be disengaged. It's also the reason that people who pay attention to voter registration trends might have noticed that unaffiliated voters often outstrip Democrats or Republicans because a lot of people are being added to the state's voter list without indicating a preference or even necessarily having any interest in politics at all.
Okay. And it's not just motor voter that contributed to this problem. There is also this 2019 bill that was pretty controversial when it passed that has a role here. Remind us about that.
Yeah, that's right. In 2019, lawmakers took a step that was supposed to be unrelated to voting at all. They passed a bill that allowed people to receive driver's licenses in Oregon without demonstrating they are U.S. citizens. This was a policy really aimed at ensuring that undocumented immigrants in the state were able to drive legally. And as you remember, Lauren, it was a big battle. The issue of granting immigrants driving privileges had come up for a vote of the public in 2014. 2014, citizens rejected it. But, in 2019, Democrats had freshly won supermajorities in both chambers. They decided to pursue the policy anyway. So beginning in 2021, people who are not citizens began showing up to the DMV to get their licenses.
Okay, so we have these two laws, motor voter and driver's licenses for undocumented people. These two laws were never supposed to come into contact with each other. What happened?
It turns out they came in contact with each other. Actually, the new law granting immigrants driver's licenses changed the nature of the motor voter law a bit, because before 2021, every person receiving a driver's license in Oregon had to demonstrate U.S. citizenship, and therefore they were eligible to be registered to vote, right? But when the newer law kicked in, people could suddenly apply for a driver's license without showing U.S. citizenship. Even people today who are citizens no longer have to demonstrate that they are a U.S. citizen in order to get a driver's license, right? So what the state says happened here is basically a clerical error on the part of folks at the DMV. The agency says it found instances where people applied for a license, and to establish their identities, they showed something like a foreign passport or a foreign birth certificate. But then those documents, which obviously don't suggest a person would be a U.S. citizen, were mistakenly entered into the system as valid proof that the person was a U.S. citizen. So their names were forwarded to the Secretary of State. They were added to the voter rolls. A series of events launched into place that never should have taken place.
Okay, I see. So the state picked a very interesting time to figure out that this is an issue. We have less than 1 month to go before ballots go out to most Oregonians. What is behind this timing?
That was one of the first things I asked last week, actually. This, has been an issue for years. We've been doing this for years. We are right on the cusp of an election. Why are we deciding to take this look so closely before November? DMV at the time kind of brushed that question aside. They said, we are just doing a proactive review of our processes. They emphasized how quickly they were making this public and the transparency of it all. It turns out it wasn't just DMV deciding to look what was going on its own, though. The state says now it got inquiries from a think tank called the Institute for Responsive Government. According to DMV, that group wanted to know about Oregon's processes and whether the state had seen any issues with automatic voter registration. And that's what prompted this review. It's not something that was just built into the system where, the system figured this out on its own. There was sort of a prodding from an outside group.
And as we record this on a Friday, we know that 306 non-citizens were mistakenly registered to vote. But that is not necessarily the end of this, right? I mean, what are the chances that the state finds more people?
It seems very high. What became clear as I asked about this last week is that even though state officials were floating these numbers, the 306, the 2 people that might have voted, there is a potential for them to grow. In fact, the DMV is still conducting an audit on this, and it's sifting through a pretty large amount of records dating back to 2021 that could have contained some of these errors in the transaction. Here's Amy Joyce. She's the state's DMV administrator.
Our audit isn't complete. So we have gotten through roughly about 10,000 files where passport was used and reviewed those. And we are well on our way of reviewing about 65,000 cases where a birth certificate was used. So that's the universe of things that we're looking at. And so that's where we are in the process.
And so obviously a lot of transactions they are looking for. The DMV said this week they had over 100 people working on this. People are working over the weekend. They're really trying to do this promptly. But Joyce would not say last Friday how far along in the process the DMV was. We have asked again and again this week for an update on numbers of errant registrations. Haven't got any additional information. What I actually heard this morning is that a final number is likely to be released early next week. And state employees I've talked to believe that number is going to be bigger than that 306. We just don't know by how much.
So of the people who were registered improperly, the state says 2 of them voted. And that could be a crime if they did so without becoming a citizen first. But let's be clear, 2 things. 1, we don't know if those people maybe did become citizens before they voted.
Right.
And 2, we do know that nobody actively tried to register to vote.
Yeah, that is something that a number of people have brought up this week, particularly Democratic lawmakers. We have heard concerns from lawmakers that people who might already be on sort of tenuous footing in the country, undocumented immigrants, might have their lives or their chances of citizenship made harder and worse because of these mistakes. Because as you say, these are not people who went to the DMV or the Secretary of State intent on defrauding the state and sort of trying to sneak their way onto the voter rolls, right? These are people who went to get a driver's license, and then at some point later, a ballot showed up at their homes. As you point out, we don't know if they might have, gotten citizenship by the time they cast a ballot. That's something that the state was looking into. But that is a piece of this, and that's one reason why, if it does turn out that they did cast a ballot and they weren't citizens, I think it is up in the air at this point whether the state would seek prosecution. But just for context, too, and you pointed this out, the numbers we are talking about are very, very small in the context of state elections. 2 people casting a vote who weren't supposed to is almost certainly not going to be the deciding factor in any election. I don't think, though, anyone is saying that's a reason to take this lightly, and it's definitely not going to mollify critics of the state's policies.
Yeah. I actually talked to the 2 leading candidates for Secretary of State this week. Those are going to be the people who will obviously oversee the elections if elected. And they both said they were very, of course, appalled and that this has to be fixed, of course. But the Republican candidate, Dennis Lithicum, he felt like this really gave credibility to these concerns that he has been raising, that he actually sued the state over, with issues over vote by mail. And then the Democratic nominee, Tobias Reed, said, yes, it needs to be fixed, but he still believes our vote by mail system is largely secure and convenient, and he wants to see it serve as a national model. How big of an issue do you think this is going to be politically for Democrats? Because Republicans have pointed out for a while that they're worried that there are problems about vote by mail, and at least in this state, Democrats have been pretty dismissive. Yeah,
haven't been really willing to engage much. I mean, this is a question that's ultimately, I think, going to be decided by how large an issue this becomes, how big those numbers get. Right now, indications seem to be that this is a pretty limited clerical error, but there are also signs Democrats know that it's a vulnerability. For instance, a couple of Democrats who are in competitive congressional races this year, Janelle Bynum and Andrea Salinas, were some of the first people to release statements criticizing the DMV for these errors. Bynum has actually asked the DOJ, the state DOJ, to investigate. Those are 2 candidates running in the U.S. House where, as I said, allegations of mass voting by undocumented immigrants have been very, very prevalent lately. And we should be clear again that there is not evidence of mass voting by undocumented immigrants, but it is clear they felt they needed to make a statement. Meanwhile, Republicans here in Oregon, as you note, are calling for various things. Senate Minority Leader Daniel Bonham this week asked Governor Kotek to institute new, stricter rules for updating and cleaning voter rolls. That's something that Republican elected officials around the country have been prioritizing this year. And House Republican leader Jeff Helfrich is calling for a legislative hearing on this. Here's what he said when I chatted with him earlier this week.
We don't know the extent of this, right? We can hear about, hey, it's not happening or it's not this, but what are you doing and what's going on? I mean, I have yet to get a briefing from the Secretary of State's office and about what's going on and what they're doing other than going through the news media. I don't think that's really a way to go about doing business if you have something that is this important.
And actually, the call for a legislative hearing on this, the timing is pretty convenient because lawmakers will be in Salem next week for interim committee hearings, what we call legislative days. But as far as we know right now, Democrats aren't willing to touch this in a legislative hearing. I've been asking all week and have been told that the House Majority Office specifically is thinking about it, doesn't know whether it will call a hearing. From what I'm hearing, though, seems pretty unlikely that Democrats will be highlighting this in a legislative hearing this close before the election. Probably not a great look for them. Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum, who's a Democrat, also doesn't appear to be itching to launch any sort of investigation right now. Her office said, it would need a request from the Secretary of State's office before it would take that step.
Okay, so we know that election officials are trying to remove non-citizens from voter rolls. But to the Republicans' points, I mean, what safeguards can be put in place now to make sure that, this isn't happening now and in the future?
Right. I mean, the DMV is offering assurances that it has essentially solved this problem. Joyce, the department administrator, told reporters last week that there are now 3 separate checks between a person submitting a passport or birth certificate, some proof of citizenship, and that person being referred to the Secretary of State to be registered to vote, just to make sure that everything is going, as expected, and not these foreign documents aren't being somehow used as proxies for proof of U.S. citizenship. And that's just kind of where we are. We still don't know how many people will ultimately be found to have been registered improperly. But elections officials around the state told me this week they are removing people from their voter lists as they get names from the Secretary of State. We are being assured that this will not be an issue this year, that the people that were registered improperly will not get ballots, and we're not going to see any meaningful non-citizen voting.
There has been so much national chatter about this overall topic in Republican national politics in particular, but this Oregon story hasn't really taken off nationally. Is that surprising? I mean,
I've been wondering, right? Given former President Donald Trump's past antipathy specifically for Portland, I sort of expected this to become an easy post on his Truth Social account. So, I've been scrolling. He talks about undocumented immigrants voting almost constantly, certainly almost daily. And this week, actually, Trump basically forced congressional Republicans to try to pass a bill that would require people to prove their citizenship before voting. I mean, this is very much at the forefront of national Republican politics. But you're right. To date, this has not caught fire on the national stage like that. That might be because Oregon is not the only state that has discovered mistakes like this. In fact, just this week, Arizona released findings that a lapse in record keeping there might have led to some non-citizens being registered. They really don't know, and they're trying to work that out. But as you know, Lauren, Arizona is a swing state. It's also a border state. That one definitely got attention from the former president and a lot of other people. Oregon's travails just have been a little more low-key, and, I don't think we have to tell listeners, we are not a swing state. Trump didn't even bother to submit a statement for this year's voters pamphlet.
Dirk, thank you for the interesting conversation.
It's always a pleasure, Lauren.
All right, let's leave it there today. This episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded in the Gert Boyle studio here at OPB. It was produced by Andrew Thien with audio engineering from Stephen Cray. Our music comes from Audio Network. And if you just cannot get enough of Politics Now and you want to see us in person, join us for a live taping of the podcast on Tuesday, October 10th at the Tomorrow Theater in Southeast Portland. And that's not the only live event you have a chance to attend this election season. Check out opb.org/election events for more information. Until then, we will be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. You can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. And while you're there, you can also become an OPB member. You can also rate and review us in your podcast app of choice or listen along on YouTube. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.